let's get back to streaming. Um, yeah, so I managed to get up onto my Instagram, my kind of artwork. What I've tended to do over the years, and it's been kind of reassuring that other people have done the same thing. I tend to throw up a picture like this, but then I don't throw up the, where it's used or the finished thing, so I've tended to kind of just take screen grabs of my working Blender, and it took me quite a long time to try and sift through and find out where I've taken, end of, the end of the final product. So anyway, I've managed to throw these things together, and if you're interested in some of the stuff I've done, I've dipped my fingers into all sorts of things. Most of the stuff that I've done is predominantly steampunk related, medieval slash steampunk, with a splattering of other things, But yeah, if you're interested, I didn't sculpt. Well, I partly sculpted this head. I am no good at sculpting. I just really not. I did the texturing on this head, and this was actually a streamer. I did a few bits and pieces of work for streamers, and but yeah, and then there's also a splattering of some random kind of photographs and portraits and such like that I did before. Various different models and various different events. We used to do an awful lot of events, and commercial photography. So, but yeah, a variety of stuff. I always believe that, when people say they're doing this and that and the other thing, and there's 10 things going on in their life, I think, wow, yeah, I mean, that is amazing. That to me is what life is about. But that doesn't mean to say that somebody who has spent their whole life doing one thing, right, or in only one area of, of a career is bad. It's not bad. It's just different, you know. Um, okay. Now, what's interesting is why. Okay. Interesting. So I'm playing around with Stream Elements at the moment, and I don't really understand how or why some of it's working and some of it doesn't work. And it's I've heard other streamers saying much the same thing, so I don't really understand why it does or doesn't work sometimes. Hmm. Okay. Right. Right, let's get on with this. So, what I wanted to do was very simply, now there are a million and one tutorials on YouTube and everywhere else about texturing, right? And I'm not one of these people. It's still a grey area for me even today, even though I've spent decades, right, playing with texturing and whatnot. And every time it comes to texturing, that I've seen some, amazing tutorials, and I have mentioned it in previous streams as well. There's nearly always something that somebody seems to leave out, which is so key to everything working, right? And I'm not a professional teacher, right? With regard to Blender, but I do kind of stick to what I know works, and I like sharing simplicity of things that work, right? And so I'm hoping that whoever sees this little mini tutorial on texturing gets some ideas and has a better a better idea of how this stuff, because it's not, especially when you want to create like, you can have as many objects as you like with various different textures. In Second Life, you have a limit. I believe it's 8 textures per mesh blend, right? So you're kind of limited, right? And there is a need, the amount of materials. There is a need to sometimes create a texture from the whole build, right? So that you would have just one, 2K square image of one texture with everything, with all the materials and everything on the one texture. So I'm gonna go through that as well. But it's not a straightforward process. But hopefully I can go through this step by step. I remember all the steps that have to be done and explain along the way why we have to keep doing these weird things, That's what I'm hoping. That's what I'm hoping. Anyway, I did a dry run on this yesterday. I didn't want to stream while I was doing the dry run because, I was, in effect, in inverted commas, kind of learning as I went along, trying to remember everything, because I do things slightly different, and we'll talk about that later on, to do with uploading to Second Life anyway. Okay, so I've got this very simple mesh, and what this represents, and I'm going to shout out to because this is not my original idea. I've kind of pinched her idea, Loxia Bun. I just loved the way that she was making game assets, and that she just really went through the texturing side of this, which I thought was just really, really neat. And I never thought, that she just made it look so easy. So anyway, the other thing that I'm going to be working with are these textures here. Now I'll explain this, right? Let me just remove these files because we don't need them, and I don't need that file. Don't need that file either. Right, so all we're working with effectively is this and this kind of water effect texture, right? Now this particular file, I actually combined 2 images. One which, I mean, these are all freely available on the internet. Basically some grass, right, and a riverbed, and then I just blended them together, right? So I mean, it's not nothing. I'm sure pretty much anyone can do that now. And then I just grabbed this, which is just some water. They're fairly low res images, right? So applying this is pretty straightforward. We first of all need to do the UVs, right? So I've only got 2 bits of mesh here. We can just UV unwrap it. Okay, nothing spectacularly wonderful about that, and it just puts these 2 things here. I have got a seam down the middle of the you can the bit under. So the only thing I created was a seam right down the middle, and I'll explain that why in a minute. So basically the UV is split into 2, right? And then this, obviously there's nothing really with this other one. This is the water effectively. Again, you can just make that as big or as small as you want. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so we just make it the full the full texture size. What I'm going to do is, I don't know whether it's remembered. Oh, it has. Okay, so on that material for this just flat plane that goes through Yeah, and then let's apply that. So we go to shading, principled BSDF for this material. It hasn't got this image inputted at all. I saw somebody the other day drag and drop this over in here, and I'm thinking, how? I don't know how they did that. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was an external image. I can't remember now, but I thought, wow, that looked pretty good. I'm just going to add a image texture. Going to grab the water, connect it up. Boom. Simple, straightforward. Nothing really fantastic about that. This is where things get a little bit more interesting, right? I am going to open up my other kind of riverbed texture, which has got this sort of stones effect and a bit of grass. Let's do the same here. Image texture. We're going to make that the riverbed texture, and we're going to plug that in there. Okay. So this is kind of what our little mini riverbed stream, whatever you want to call it, is going to be. Right. Pretty straightforward. Right. So we've got 2 bits of mesh. Right. The water, not really a problem. The riverbed, right. So let me just hide this bit. The riverbed is a mess, right? The texture is pretty. Now, if you know about UVs and texturing and everything, you're going to find this seriously boring, right? There's nothing new in anything that I'm going to be saying here. This is for people who are struggling to try and come to terms with how to get textures to work, you know, at a fairly simple level. So UV, this is where we need to bring in the texture. Now, if anyone wants to know, right, because I used to struggle with this when I first started learning texturing, this view that we've got here, which is the UV editor, and all of these, any of these files that you seem to bring in, how can I explain it? The UV part is very important, obviously, because we're working on the model here, and the islands, as it were, that we're working on, right, are these. Can you see that moving on the right hand side? Okay. I always use this. These tend to correspond to the editing mode in the viewport, right? So you're here in the UVs. So the mode that you're in, I'm in island mode, right, which is an extra thing. So that's the number 4. Number 3 is face mode. Number 2 is edge mode. Number 1 is vertice mode, right? Just very simple. So I switch. I tend to nearly always work in the whole island, right? The whole island mode. You know, so where there's a seam down the middle, right, I just marked, so I highlighted that edge here, a right hand click, and then just go mark seam, right, and you'll see it turns from just a normal single black line. When you highlight it, right hand click, mark seam, and it turns it into a red line. Okay, so now we have 2 islands. So wherever there's a seam, okay, I used to struggle because I used to think, well, why hasn't the UV unwrapping wrapped this in a logical way? And what, because, okay, let's go back a few years ago. What I would have done, this is where I really struggled before. I would have created a texture that, because I want, effectively, I want the grass, right? I want the grass here and here, and part of the grass here and here, and I want the riverbed to be here and here, right? That's what I want. That's what I want to try and do. Now, in the beginning, I seriously struggled because I kept thinking, oh my goodness, I have to create a texture that's going to fit this UV map, and I guess I was struggling to understand that's not how it worked. But then all the tutorials that I used to follow Uh, I just couldn't follow it. It didn't make any sense to me doing it that way. But now it does. Right? Now it does. So we no longer have to. Now I use really, really complicated textures on things, and I can get my UV map and alter my UV map to fit the texture, which is what you really want to do. This view here, all I can say is this view of the texture that we're looking at is really only a reference, right? I wish somebody had told me this before, because I used to get seriously confused when I I used to, let me bring back the water. I used to click on here, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so why is this picture still here, right? And you know, you'd kind of go in here and you'd think like, but it's not. This has got a material with a water on it. Why isn't it showing up in the UV map? And of course, if only somebody had ever said to me, well, actually, you need to change the image, right? Because this is only a temporary thing. It's not like this doesn't change when you click on each one of these. Now, if somebody can tell me whether that is something that can happen or not, I don't really know. Don't understand why Blender doesn't change it automatically, because logically speaking, you'd think if I clicked on here and the material is a different material and it has a different image attached to it, why doesn't the UV update at the same time? Like I just kind of don't understand that bit. I mean, it says update automatically, but it's not. It's not doing anything. It's not. I understood it to be that when you clicked on, you know, whichever face you're looking at with the material attached to it, that this updated itself, but it doesn't, right? So I can only say I wish somebody had told me that this actually was a temporary viewing of the texture, any texture. I can put any texture I like in here, right? I mean, that hasn't got anything on it. A rendered result hasn't got anything on it, you know, right? So there's my texture, and I'm highlighting this bit. So we go back into edit mode. We highlight all of the UVs, and of course now what I want to do is, so if I view this like here so I can see what I'm doing, I hope I'm not making this too long-winded. So first of all, I'm going to highlight this particular island, right? And if I just grab that and okay, so I'm looking at the right hand side, right? If I grab this, rotate 90 degrees, right? And then move this. Ooh, there we go. You see, this is kind of the right way around. Okay. So I want the grass. You know, bear with me 1 minute while I get rid of this. We don't need that. Sorry. Okay. Right. So I'm looking at this, and ideally what I want is the grass to kind of this, imagine this is a riverbank, right? And the grass kind of almost meets the water, right? I want this to kind of look like, so I'm going to bring, I can constrain the movement because you can just click on Y, which is up and down, right? Or X, which is left to right, right? So if I place it there, if I limit my G to grab in this vertical one only, I only have to move the mouse up and down. So I'm kind of thinking, okay, that looks pretty good about there, right? Okay, we've got the pebbles here in the stream. We've kind of got a blend of grass and stream, and then obviously we got the grass. Okay, easy peasy. Let's do the same for this one. Now, because the grass is down the bottom on this one, I'm guessing that I probably have to, yeah. So I need to rotate this probably around the other way. Grab, Yep, there we go. Right. So again, I can just place that and then say I only want to go, no. Right, so if I move it that way, grab in the Y only. Right, so I'm going to move this until about there. Right. Ooh, look at what's happened. Right. This is not a repeating, what do they call it? Repeating texture. I forget now what the technical term is. But obviously this is not, we've got this kind of dark area, light area, dark area, light area, because obviously these the UVs have been swapped around the right way to fit this. So what I need to do is I need to flip this, right? If you can imagine this, we're dealing with 2D here, right? We can only go up and down. But the UVs can flip 360 degrees, right? So what I would ideally want to do is to have this area and this area the same, right? Now, if I rotate this on the Y 180 degrees, no. How did I do this? See, this is what I'm saying. This is... how did I do this again? Oh no, okay, so rotate X 180 degrees. No. I want to flip it, but I want to flip it along this way. And maybe I scaled it. No. Ah. Brain work. How did I get this to rotate? I don't think I can rotate on the Z, can I? No. See, I know how to do it manually, right? Manually, what I would do is go into Edge Select, grab it, and just keep... oh. Are we on the right side? Yeah, we're on this side. We've grabbed this UV. Oh, of course, I didn't grab it, or did I? And I know how to do it manually, right? So you just grab that edge on the X and move it right over the other side, right? But that's doing it manually. How did I do it? I can't remember now. Did I think... oh, I know. Hang on. Sorry. See, it's always a learning. What I did was this. That's right. There was an option in here. Was it to transform? Transform. See, this is painful for some people to watch, I'm sure. Oh, this just does my head in when you kind of know it. Select. I want to not invert. Damn it. If I go back to this, right, I know how to do this. So if I G on the X, basically what I'm doing is basically rotating, flipping the UV over, right? Go back to this and then grab it over here. Now, I mean, if you're okay about doing that kind of thing, because the UV needs to expand a bit, we can do this. Let's go back in. Right, I'm going to move this UV on the Y until it looks around about the same. Okay, this is the riverbed is going to be underneath water. So no one is, but so I think if you were using this as an asset for something, they would notice that the UV's flipped around the wrong way. So hopefully that has made sense what I just did. I can't flip it on the Y. I couldn't flip it on the X. I needed to kind of flip it on the Z, and I'm sure there was something that I did. There was something that I did. Mirror. Did I mirror it? Oh, you're kidding me. That's what I did. Okay. Right. Apologies for that. I knew it. There was something up here. So I mirrored it on the X-axis. I didn't grab it. Yeah. So I mirrored it. Right. So much easier. Right. Learning learnt, and now I will probably remember that myself again. So now we have a riverbed that kind of looks okay. Now the really neat thing that I had never really, and you have to be careful doing this. The one thing that so if we go to face select mode, right, what I had originally was where the grass and the riverbed meet, the bit in between didn't really line up properly. So you have to be kind of careful with stretching textures, to be honest. It looks okay if it's going to be partly hidden with something, it's going to be partly hidden with water. But you can actually tweak this a little bit by grabbing and putting in the Y, and then see how it kind of almost compresses the texture up a little bit. And we can do the same on this side as well. I just wanted to grab that face. I'm going to G and Y, and then again, just compress it up a little bit. It just kind of tidies up the edge a little bit. There we go. And it looks a little bit better. I go into preview. Oh, of course, I haven't got any lights, sorry. But anyway, that's something else I want to show you actually that you may already know about if you're into lighting and all of that. And we do need lights actually to burn our texture out, so I might touch on that. So anyway, that's the bank and the riverbed. Happy about that. If we bring back the riverbed, right, now the riverbed and the bank kind of looks pretty good, right? Now if we go back to here, I generally don't tend, unless I absolutely need to, because I've got too many textures, I don't necessarily need to create a single image texture with both of these textures on it, right? But I will run through the process, and hopefully I won't have too many screw ups. Okay, let me just save this. Now, if I was building my, castle house or whatever, and I wanted to go down that route, at this particular point in time, I could quite simply join these two together and export them out and bring them into Second Life, and they would be perfect, right? For something like this, I touched on it before, I would build like a physics, very simple physics model to go around this to bring the land impact down. But you can get away with that. You can export this out now as a collada file. All right, riverbed texture. Okay, so I'm going to do selection only, copy the texture options, and we'll touch on the UV mapping in a minute, but then I could export that out. Boom, that's done. I can then import that as mesh straight into Second Life, and there wouldn't be a problem. It would look exactly like this. I've just noticed as well, because I'm doing this as a tutorial, I didn't apply the scale on that, which is quite interesting. But anyway, all right, let's say you want to be really careful about your image textures, the amount of image textures. This could be a model that had 10 textures on it, right? You know, the whole thing, and you wanted to bring the whole thing into Second Life. So the process is a little bit long-winded, in as much as you need to, I would definitely back up your files, right? You need to, well, actually, you don't necessarily need to do this, but I would definitely work on a duplicate, okay? So I would definitely duplicate what you've got so that you don't lose, and just put it in the same place, and then turn off. Okay, so I'm now working on a copy, right? So if I screw up, it doesn't matter because I can go back to my original again. Now, where things have changed for me is that before you would have to join all of your mesh together, right? All of your everything that you've made, and you'd have to join it together, and then you've got this unbelievable mess of UVs and whatnot to deal with. This is a fairly simple project, so you don't necessarily have to do that. The process is, if I just talk through this mesh here has got their own, they've each got a UV, right? They've both got their own separate UV, but it's kind of called the same, which is also confusing, right? And they're both called UV map because when you do UV unwrapping, or when you create a piece of mesh, this is the default name it gives it, right? And this I also found confusing because I used to keep thinking, well, each of these parts have got the same UV map, haven't they? And no, they don't have their own UV maps. They just call it by default UV map, and the UV map only applies to this one thing, right? So between the fact that I thought in the beginning that each UV map was being used on all the various different things, it just didn't make any sense to me. And then between this, right, between this thing here where you're in your UV editor here, but you can just switch and change these textures at random, and the UV editor doesn't seem to care what you're working on. I found that really, really confusing. So I hope that clears up something for somebody, right? This is just for reference. This is for reference. What makes a difference is when you go into the shading, that actually this is plugged into your principled BSDF, and that's what's being used to map this out on here, right? So it's all rather interesting, right? Ready for the kind of slightly confusing bit, which is, I don't blame anyone that gets confused with a lot of this stuff, because it really, really is confusing, right? So I found it actually quite easy, quite reassuring, or a little bit more confident. So I'm going to, when you click on X, right, it's not deleting the file. I always used to think this as well. So I ended up with massive amounts of textures in here. When I think back on it, it was just crazy, really. But you can get rid of this, right? Because all I'm doing is I'm just removing it from the UV map, the UV editor bit. But it actually hasn't disappeared at all, And of course, I had spent so much time, hours, editing textures to fit the UV map so that it would work properly. Of course, I was really afraid of, and I did screw up several times. Actually, I overwrote, very complicated texture files that I'd created because I didn't really understand what was going on here. But anyway, I think these are little areas that I think Blender, it would just make it so much easier if when you clicked on an item, right, and maybe there's a reason why they don't do it, but if you clicked on something, mesh in, like I'm here in the shading editing panel, right, that this changed, right, but it doesn't, because like I can go back in here and then you know, yep, it ain't there. It is confusing. It is confusing. Anyway, and sometimes I think that the oh, we're actually in the image editor here, not the UV editor. Yeah, okay. That's fine. That's just so that we can see what's going on. But yeah, if you clicked on each one of these, you'd think that this would change, but it doesn't. It doesn't. You can okay, it does it there, but it's just really irritating. Right. So if I go into there, oh, okay. They have changed it a little bit then, only in this particular mode, as far as I can see. Not when you're in UV editing mode. Okay, I've learned something else then today, because I know for a fact that that never used to do that. It's a bit annoying that you would actually have the UV editor down here, but anyway. Okay, so I don't really want that. I don't really want that there. Okay, so we're going to work. This is an image editor, and we're going to just work on this. I need to create a new image for my combined textures. So the idea is we are going to create another unique UV map that combines both of these objects. That's basically what we're going to do, and it will be used on both objects, right? At the moment, this is not the same UV map that we're looking at here for this one or this one. See, the name doesn't change, right? But we are going to create a unique image. We're going to create a new image. We're going to call it combined, just as a matter of thingy, combined texture, right? I'm going to make it, let's just say I make it really big. No, let's keep it small, because otherwise it's just going to be, we're not going to have any alpha on there, and we're going to create a brand new image. Now this always threw me, right? Always threw me, because I used to think, oh my God, why is it black? Well, that's the default color. It's the default color it gets given, so you can kind of ignore that when you create a new image. And sometimes it would change because somebody else would say, oh, you need to change it to white or green or whatever, and yeah, I that always threw me. So basically we've just created a temporary image slot, right? That happens to be what we're looking at right here in the image editor. We now need to create, for each of these pieces of mesh, we go into this data panel, and we need to create a new UV map, right? Now see, by default it calls it UV map, right? So I'm going to call it, I'm just going to call it combined. You need to remember the name for this, because we're going to do the same thing for the water, and we need to create a name that is the same, right? Combined. Okay, so we've now got a UV map that is the same and highlighted for both the water and the riverbank. Yeah, hopefully this makes sense, and you'll see why we need this in a minute, because at the moment these pieces of mesh are using this UV map, right? We want to generate a new UV map that's going to look different, and we're going to use this texture to bake our texture to, right? It will sink in eventually, right? So now we have to play in each on each part in here. We need to tell each of these pieces of mesh that have got a material and texture attached to them, right, where we want to bake the new texture and which UV map we need to use, right? I don't suppose it really matters which way around you do it, but what we could do now is we could grab both of these things. You would grab everything that you wanted in your new your new bake texture bake, right? So we're going to select everything, okay, remembering that these are two different pieces of mesh. We're now going to go to UV editing, UV. See, I can see this doesn't change. Why doesn't it change? Right, so we want our new texture, right, which we just called combined texture, okay? And remembering this is just a reference. Now, behind the scenes, obviously, your item would be probably looking a lot complicated, but here we've got all our UV maps are all kind of layered on top of each other, right? So we now want to create a new UV map, remembering, right? And I will keep going on about this because we need to remember that we need to have this highlighted, right? For both of these items, we need to make sure that we've got this highlighted. Okay, so we're going to go back here. We're going to select everything. We're going to create a new UV map of all the objects. Just put it in here, unwrap. Okay. That's interesting. Sometimes you wonder about Blender. Why has it put this on top of or behind these? Okay, doesn't matter. We can select all of this that's in here and we can go UV pack inside or pack islands. Okay, I leave it pretty much as it is and it will rearrange them in a way, you know. So this is now our UV map called combined, right? Because this is the river and this is the riverbank and the bottom, right? We can just check that out. Okay, there's the river. If we select the other bit of mesh, go into edit mode, and there is the other part. Okay, so both of them together are now on our new combined texture image and using the combined UV. I do hope I'm not making this more complicated. I'm going kind of purposefully slow because I wish that I had somebody else who went this slow so that I could follow along and do it and, you know, learn, because the amount of times I used to replay these tutorial videos to try and get my head around how on earth all this worked, because it didn't sink in, right? It didn't seem to matter how many times I tried it. I screwed up so many times. And again, I used to get frustrated and then just give up. And I used to think, oh, why am I bothering? Life's too short, you know? So anyway, what we need to do now is we need to tell the node editor, right, at the moment, it knows about the other UV and the other textures, but now we're asking it to create a new texture based on the old UVs and textures, right? So now we need to add a texture image, right? We need to tell it what it's going to bake to. Okay, it's not going to be attached to anything to do with our original bits. We need to tell it that we want it to bake to this new texture that we've got, right? Now, to make sure that things work correctly, you also need to add a, if I search for UV, the UV map node, right? Because we've got two UVs, you start getting weird stuff happening because Blender doesn't necessarily know what it is you're asking it to do. So what this does is it says, without a doubt, we want to use this UV combined, right? Combined UV map that we've just created. And we only want to use that UV to go into this texture. And we need to make sure that we highlight this. Now, in fact, actually, I'm going to copy this, which is kind of good. Make sure that's highlighted, right? And I'm making sure that combined is highlighted. And now I'm going to go back to the bank and the riverbed, and I'm going to paste the same thing in here, right? So we're asking it to go to the combined texture only using this UV, right? We need to make sure that this is highlighted. Now we can see both things happening at once, or we can see it one at a time. I generally tend to highlight both of these meshes, making sure that that's highlighted and the UV is highlighted. Right, you can just make sure that that's highlighted, and the UV map is highlighted. Go to the water, that's highlighted, combined is highlighted. You can now highlight both items in there, and we're now going to go to bake to our texture. Okay, now we only want the diffuse because we're not using lighting. If you wanted shadows and ambient occlusion and all of those really fancy things, if you wanted all that, then you would have to go down the combined route, and what influences the texture and all of those things, and you can get some really nice stuff. But for the sake of this, all we're going to do is go diffuse. We're going to turn off direct and indirect, and we just want the color, right? And the target is an image texture, where we've already told it it's a texture, and the texture is over here, right? Now you can bake, right? And we can see the baking happening down here. And if you look at this black, see, here comes the textures, right? There you go. It's done it already. Very important. And again, I wish somebody had said this several times to me. We have got to save this image. We need to save this image here, because this is very important. Again, it doesn't do it automatically. So we've got a little star on the word image here. So we want to go and save this image. Okay, and I'm going to call it, well, it's called it combined image. I don't necessarily like compression on any file. And then we go save as an image. Now we've got a copy of that combined texture. So if we go back to this viewer, we've got the riverbed and bank here, we've got the water, but now we've got this combined texture, right, for that piece of mesh. Now that's pretty much it with regard to the texture, right? And if we go back to the UV editing, we can now see that the UV map that we used combined is now on here. Sorry, I need to get this call. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about our real big apologies for that. And I forgot to switch my microphone off for some of that as well. But yeah, we have to do what we have to do. As much as I would love to do 3D full time, you can't do it in today's world, unfortunately, and I don't think I'm that good enough anyway. So I will probably cut this out of the video that I will upload to YouTube. But anyway, apologies. I'm back. The texture is obviously now baked, right, into one image, and we've saved the image, right? So if we were in this particular mode on the screen, the image wording here would have that little star or asterisk above it, because it hadn't been saved. Right. Now we've got our original mesh that we used, okay, but we're working on obviously the second. In theory, now we can remove this and we can plug this into here, right? And we can go back to the other piece and we can use our baked image and put that into there, right? Now the reason why, and I forgot this, didn't I? I didn't say about the lighting. The reason why this has come out so dark. Yeah, it's come out seriously dark. And the reason for that is because I needed to light this up just very, very slightly. But anyway. Okay, but you get the gist. When we're now using, of course, this never changes, does it? The combined texture. We're now using this texture here on our mesh. Now we can join this and export it out as a collada file and squirt it straight into Second Life, and you've only got one texture instead of two. But yeah, that's basically it. That is basically it. You can, if you really want to, remove this UV map from this mesh here, because it's not using that one anyway, so we can select that, highlight that, and remove it. Okay, and now that UV is now the main one, and that's basically it. I just thought that this was a pretty neat a pretty neat way of producing sort of one texture, and I just wish I'd had that explanation when I was starting out. I really do. I really, really do. But anyway, that's it. That is basically it.